the 15th of September, 1940. Biggin Hill, Kent, 11:45 a.m. The sky was streaked with low clouds when Sergeant Pilot James Ginger Mitchell felt the Rolls-Royce Merlin III engine of his Hawker Hurricane Mark I shudder for the last time before silence. His right hand trembled on the stick as the altimeter marked 22,000 feet. Below, 3 dark dots grew against London's gray horizon. Dornier, due 17 seconds. German bombers flying in tight formation, loaded with death. The smell of oil and cordite already filled the cramped Hurricane cockpit. Mitchell didn't know that in 15 minutes, he would change the course of the war, that his name would be whispered in every London pub, that his sturdy and seemingly outdated machine would force Luftwaffe pilots to swallow every joke they'd made about the British ugly duckling. All he knew was that he was shaking. From cold, fear, or rage, it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that someone had to stop those bombers before they reached the heart of the empire. James Mitchell had been born on a sheep farm in Yorkshire, where the wind cut across the hills like blades of ice and where men learned to face storms head-on, never sideways. At 22, his hands were calloused from milking cows, and his thick accent made the Cranwell officers roll their eyes. Before the war, his biggest worry was whether the sheep would survive the brutal winter of 1938. Now, flying a fighter made of wood and fabric, he carried on his shoulders the burden of defending his island homeland against the most powerful air force in the world. In the letters he sent home, he never mentioned the fear he felt each morning before dawn, the cold sweat down his spine when he heard the distant roar of Daimler-Benz engines, or how many of his squadron mates didn't return the night before. He wrote about the weather, the bad food at the base, how he missed the fresh milk from the farm. What he really wanted to say was that he dreamed of seeing the green fields of Yorkshire again, of hearing the sheep bleating at sunrise, of hugging his younger sister who, in her latest letters, asked when the war would end. The Battle of Britain had begun in July, when Hermann Göring promised Hitler that his Luftwaffe would sweep the RAF from the skies in 4 days. The Germans had overwhelming numbers, more than 2,600 aircraft against fewer than 700 British fighters. They had veteran pilots who had learned their tactics in the skies over Spain, modern machines with direct injection engines that didn't cut out in negative dives, fast bombers that carried tons of explosives. They had the experience of blitzkrieg, the confidence of those who had conquered Europe in months. What they didn't have was real knowledge about that seemingly obsolete British fighter confronting them every day. In Germany, Luftwaffe pilots mocked the Hurricane, calling it Der alte Vogel, the old bird. Their intelligence reports described it as slow, heavy, and built with outdated wood and fabric construction. Compared to the sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109 or the modern Junkers Ju-88, the Hurricane seemed like a relic of a bygone era. But they didn't know that this primitive construction meant a cannon shell could pass through the fabric fuselage without detonating, that the plane could return home with holes the size of plates and still land safely. They didn't know its stable gun platform allowed devastating accuracy, that its 8 Browning 303 machine guns concentrated into a lethal cone of fire that could literally saw a bomber in half. By the way, which moment from World War II hits you the hardest? Tell me in the comments. Mitchell adjusted the Hurricane's trim as he watched the Dorniers approach London. His aircraft, P-3308, had been delivered to the RAF just 3 months earlier, still smelling of fresh paint and new oil. It was a standard Hurricane Mark I, equipped with a 1,030 horsepower Merlin III engine, a fixed-pitch 2-blade wooden propeller, and an armament setup that made veterans nod in approval. 8 Browning 303 machine guns arranged in groups of 4 in each wing, each loaded with 300 rounds. Its official top speed was 330 miles per hour at 17,500 feet. But in practice, especially with the new 100-octane fuel that allowed use of the emergency boost override, the Hurricane could reach 340 miles per hour in the first minutes of combat. What really mattered wasn't speed. The Bf-109E was still 40 miles per hour faster, but maneuverability. The Hurricane could turn tighter than any German fighter, its thick and wide wings providing exceptional lift in tight turns. It was a born brawler, built to take on heavy bombers and survive the chaos of aerial battle. Mitchell knew every vibration of his machine, every hum of the Merlin engine, every quirk of the controls. He knew the fuel tanks and the wing roots were vulnerable to rear attacks. that the main tank just behind the instrument panel could ignite in seconds if hit, but he also knew that the recently installed Linatech's lining could seal small holes and give him time to escape. The radio crackled in the cramped cockpit. Bandits at 2 o'clock, altitude 16,000, climbing, vector 180, go ahead, Ginger. The sector controller's voice sounded calm, almost bored, but Mitchell could detect the underlying tension. It was the third interception of the day, and it was barely past noon. The British radar system had detected a large formation approaching the Thames estuary. Judging by the scope size, probably 50 or more aircraft. Mitchell pushed the throttle forward, feeling the Merlin respond with a rising growl that made the entire fuselage vibrate. The Hurricane wasn't as elegant as the Spitfire, didn't have the aerodynamic beauty of R.J. Mitchell's machine, but it had something the Germans hadn't yet understood. It was nearly indestructible. Its welded steel tube frame, covered by fabric and plywood, could absorb damage that would down any German fighter. It was a flying bulldog, stubborn and tough, designed not to impress in air shows, but to take and deliver blows in real combat. The wind howled through small holes in the canopy as Mitchell checked his instruments again. Oil pressure, normal. Coolant temperature, within limits. Fuel enough for 30 minutes of intense combat. The machine guns had been harmonized to converge at 250 yards, ideal distance for attacking bombers. Each trigger pull would release 160 rounds per second. A storm of metal capable of turning any German aircraft into flying scrap. The first sign of the German bombers was a line of dark dots against the low clouds, rapidly growing in size. Mitchell felt the familiar adrenaline surge, his heart pounding harder, his mouth going dry. 3 Dornier, due 17 seconds, flying in tight formation at around 16,000 feet, heading toward London. But something was off. Where were the escort fighters? Where were the feared Bf 109 seconds that usually protected the bombers? Mitchell scanned the sky for the telltale silhouettes of German fighters. Nothing. It was impossible that the Germans would send bombers unescorted over London in broad daylight. It had to be a trap. He squinted through the distorted Perspex canopy, searching for any suspicious movement in the clouds above. The Hurricane responded smoothly to the controls as he banked in a wide arc to position for attack. The altitude difference was small, just 6,000 feet, but enough for a good approach from behind and above. The standard procedure was to attack bombers head-on, breaking their formation, but Mitchell was alone. With no squadron mates for support, he had to rely on the sturdiness of his machine and the accuracy of his weapons. The smell of cordite was already seeping into the cockpit through the small gaps around the guns. It was a scent that had become familiar, almost comforting. The smell of war. Of machines fighting machines. Of men testing the limits of courage and technology 6 miles above the earth. The approach was nearly silent, just the steady roar of the Merlin III and the wind whistling over the wings. Mitchell positioned the Hurricane about 400 yards behind and slightly above the rightmost Dornier. At that distance, he could clearly see details of the German aircraft. The slim fuselage that earned it the nickname Flying Pencil, the glass panels of the Bombardier Navigator's nose cockpit, even the camouflage colors dark green over light blue. Standard Luftwaffe pattern for operations over Britain. What he couldn't see was that inside that bomber, 3 young men like him were also shaking with fear and resolve. The pilot, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Weber, from Munich, thought of the girlfriend he had left behind in Bavaria. The navigator Bombardier, Unteroffizier, Franz Dietrich, from Hamburg, carried a photo of his parents standing proudly in front of their little bakery. The gunner, Gefreiter Hans Müller, from Berlin, had just turned 19 and dreamed of becoming a history teacher after the war. They were ordinary men fighting a war none of them had chosen, flying deadly machines over a country many never wanted to attack. But at that moment, at a distance that could be closed in seconds at combat speed, they were simply the enemy. Targets, symbols of the regime that threatened everything Mitchell held sacred. The Hurricane shuddered slightly as Mitchell opened fire. The recoil of the 8 Browning machine guns was considerable, but the aircraft's stable platform allowed him to keep them on target during extended bursts. Red tracers cut through the air like flashes of lightning, converging on the Dornier in a deadly cone. Mitchell saw the first hits immediately, small explosions of metal and glass along the German bomber's fuselage, bits of skin flying into the slipstream. But the Dornier was resilient, built to absorb damage, and kept flying in formation. Weber, the German pilot, felt the impacts like punches to the gut, but kept control of the aircraft. He had trained for this, had mentally prepared for the moment when British fighters would appear in his rearview mirrors. What he hadn't prepared for was the devastating precision of the Hurricane's concentrated firepower. The 303 machine guns, individually not very powerful, combined to produce a volume of fire no aircraft could endure for long. Mitchell held the trigger down for another 3 seconds, an eternity in air combat, before pulling up and right, avoiding a possible response from the German gunner. This was when the Hurricane's superior maneuverability shone. Where a Bf-109 would lose speed and effectiveness in tight turns, the British fighter seemed to thrive, its thick wings generating lift even at extreme angles. Then something happened that no one had foreseen, something not found in any air combat manual. Weber's Dornier, mortally wounded by the Hurricane's gunfire, began to spew a dark liquid that Mitchell initially mistook for leaking fuel. But when the liquid reached his cockpit through the small openings around the windshield, the smell wasn't of gasoline. It was oil-thick, hot oil from the German bomber's Bramo 323P engine, now bleeding through ruptured lines and punctured crankcases. The Hurricane's windshield became coated in a dark, oily film that reduced visibility to nearly zero. Mitchell felt panic rise in his throat. Flying blind at 16,000 feet, with enemy bombers nearby and potential German fighters arriving at any moment, was almost certainly a death sentence. But he had grown up in Yorkshire, where snowstorms could last for days and where a shepherd needed to find his flock even when he couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. There was something in his upbringing, some stubbornness inherited from the frozen hills of northern England that prevented him from panicking. Instead, Mitchell did something the manuals would say was impossible. He kept flying by instruments while holding the attack formation, relying on memory and instinct to maintain his position relative to the German bombers. The earth throbbed like a heart on the verge of stopping. Down below in London, thousands of people gazed skyward as the drama unfolded thousands of feet above. Most saw only distant dots moving against the clouds, but to those who understood aviation, the characteristic silhouettes were distinguishable. The Hurricane was unmistakable: thick wings, tall fuselage, angular outline contrasting with the smoother lines of the German bombers. At the Ministry of Defense, high-ranking officers tracked the interception's progress on radar. It was one of many skirmishes that day, but there was something different about this one. The number of German aircraft was decreasing, suggesting that at least one of the bombers had been downed or severely damaged. What they couldn't see was the personal drama unfolding 3 miles above, where a young Yorkshire farm boy was struggling to control his temporarily blinded aircraft, while a German pilot from Munich desperately tried to keep his wounded bomber airborne long enough to get home. Mitchell frantically wiped the windshield with his leather glove, managing to clear some of the oil and restore limited visibility. What he saw made his heart stop. The Hurricane had dangerously closed in on the Dornier during his blind flight, and now was less than 50 yards from the German bomber's tail. Things happened very quickly after that. Mitchell instinctively pulled the control stick downward, trying to dive beneath the bomber, but the relative speed was too high and the space too tight. For a split second that seemed to last hours, he had a crystal clear view inside the Dornier's cabin through the glass windows. He saw the pale face of the German gunner, a boy who looked no older than 19, his eyes wide with terror. He saw the German pilot's hands clenched on the controls, trying to manage a machine that was slowly dying. He saw maps scattered across the cabin floor, family photos taped to the panel, and small personal items that turned that war machine into something tragically human. And then, in a fraction of a second that would change the course of his life and the war, Mitchell made a decision found in no manual. Instead of trying to avoid the collision, he pushed the stick forward and aimed the Hurricane directly at the Dornier's fuselage. It wasn't a planned act of heroism, nor a calculated military tactic. It was the primal instinct of a man who had grown up protecting sheep from wolves, who had learned that sometimes the only way to stop a predator is to face it head-on, even if it means risking your own life. The Hurricane's propeller tore through the German bomber's metal skin like a saw through wood. The impact was violent, but not instantly fatal for either aircraft. The Dornier immediately began to lose altitude, its controls damaged, the right engine spitting smoke and sparks. Weber struggled with the controls, trying to keep the aircraft level long enough for his crew to bail out, but the descent speed was increasing rapidly. Mitchell's Hurricane had lost part of its propeller and was shaking violently, but the sturdy Merlin engine kept running. It was exactly what Sidney Cam, the aircraft's designer, had envisioned when he built the welded steel tube structure. The hurricane could survive damage that would destroy any other aircraft. Mitchell felt blood trickle from a cut on his forehead where he'd hit the panel during the impact, but his controls were still responsive. Most importantly, the other two Dorniers were breaking formation, abandoning their route to London. The bombing mission had failed. London was safe for now, but the cost was becoming clear. Both the Hurricane and the Dornier were doomed, descending slowly toward London suburbs. Mitchell checked his altitude, 8,000 feet, and falling. Weber, in the Dornier, was ordering his crew to abandon ship. Over the radio, Mitchell could hear fragmented German transmissions, tense voices in a language he didn't fully understand, but whose desperate tone was universal. Young men facing death, trying to save one another in the final moments before impact. There were no enemies in that moment, only human beings sharing the primal terror of falling. At 4,000 feet, Mitchell made the decision to bail out. The Hurricane was behaving more erratically, and he wasn't sure he could manage a crash landing without endangering civilians on the ground. He unbuckled his seatbelt, opened the canopy, and felt the cold English autumn wind slice across his face like blades. It was September, but at that altitude, the air was thin and cutting. His fingers, numb from cold and adrenaline, fumbled with the parachute straps. Below, he could see London's suburbs approaching fast, neat rows of houses with gardens, streets winding through green spaces, chimneys releasing thin smoke from home fireplaces. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, completely unaware of the drama unfolding above their heads. Mitchell thought of his sister, who was probably at that very moment making tea on the Yorkshire farm, listening to radio reports about the air battle over London. He thought about the letter he would write to her that night if he survived. How would he explain that he had destroyed his own plane to bring down a German bomber? How would he describe the expression on that young gunner's face in the seconds before the collision? How would he find the words to capture the moment when two deadly machines met in the sky and forever changed the course of the most destructive war in human history? The parachute opened with a jolt that nearly dislocated his shoulder, but Mitchell had never felt so relieved in his life. The relative silence after the constant roar of the Merlin engine was almost deafening. He could hear the wind in the parachute's lines, his own heavy breathing, and in the distance, the sound of fire and ambulance sirens converging on the crash sites. The Hurricane had crashed in an open area outside London, creating a smoldering crater but causing no civilian casualties. The Dornier, heavier and out of control, had shattered upon impact with the ground, but Mitchell saw at least two parachutes descending toward nearby fields. At least some of the German crew had managed to bail out in time. During the descent, Mitchell had time to process what had happened. In 15 minutes of combat, he had changed the course of the Battle of Britain, not through planned heroism or superior tactics, but through a combination of luck, determination, and the incredible toughness of his aircraft. The Hurricane had proven to be exactly what Sidney Cam had designed, not the fastest or most elegant fighter, but the most durable, the one that could take punishment and keep fighting. It was the difference between a greyhound and a bulldog, between elegance and brute strength. And on that particular day, over the skies of London, brute strength was exactly what the situation demanded. Mitchell landed heavily in a cultivated field about 15 miles south of London, tumbling several times before managing to unclip the parachute straps. His legs trembled, a mix of fading adrenaline and the shock of what he had just lived through. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from two different points, the wreckage of his own aircraft and that of the German bomber. Local farmers were already running toward him, some carrying farming tools, uncertain whether he was British or German, until they saw the blue RAF uniform. "Are you all right, son?" asked an older man with a Surrey accent, helping him up. "We saw the whole fight up there. What the hell did you do to that German bomber?" Mitchell looked up at the sky, where tiny fragments of metal still glinted in the sun as they fell. How could he explain that he had used his fighter as a projectile? How could he describe the moment he decided the best way to protect London was to destroy his own aircraft? "I did what had to be done," he replied simply. And in that moment, watching the smoke rise from the wreckage of two war machines, he knew it was true. The Hurricane had proven something that day. It had shown that it was not an old bird or an obsolete relic. It was a war machine built for one specific purpose: to protect Britain, no matter the cost. The aftermath of the battle rippled like waves through RAF Command and the German High Command. At the 11 Group headquarters, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park logged another victory for the Hurricanes in his daily report, but there was something different about this one. The unlikely tactic used by Sergeant Mitchell ramming was not in any manual, but had proven effective under extreme circumstances. More importantly, it demonstrated a quality the Germans hadn't accounted for in their assessment of the RAF: the willingness of British pilots to sacrifice their own lives to protect their country. On the German side, the loss of an aircraft due to ramming caused considerable consternation. German pilots had been trained to face conventional tactics, dogfights, interception attacks, even the possibility of being outnumbered. But they hadn't been prepared to face opponents willing to use their own planes as weapons. It was a show of determination that challenged some of the basic premises of the German air campaign over Britain. If British pilots were willing to go that far to defend their bases and cities, perhaps the RAF's resistance was much stronger than Göring had calculated. Perhaps the conquest of British airspace would take much longer than the 4 days originally promised to Hitler. For Mitchell, the weeks that followed were a strange mix of celebration and grim reflection. He was decorated for his actions, promoted to flight sergeant, and became something of a minor celebrity in the British press. But the nights were hard. He dreamed of the German gunner's face, imagined the families mourning the Dornier's crew, wondered if there had been another way to stop the bombing. The Hurricane P-3308 was declared a total loss, but its destruction had saved hundreds, perhaps thousands of civilian lives in London. It was a grim calculation, but a necessary one. War was made of such decisions, moments when ordinary men were forced to choose between lesser and greater evils, between personal sacrifice and larger consequences. Mitchell had chosen well, but that didn't make the nights easier. He finally wrote to his sister a long letter in which he tried to explain not just what had happened, but how it had changed him. "The Hurricane is not just a machine," he wrote. "It's an extension of our resolve. It's proof that sometimes the solution to impossible problems doesn't come from elegance or technical superiority, but from the simple refusal to give up." The letter was censored before it reached Yorkshire, but Mitchell's sister kept it for the rest of her life, a reminder of a brother who had grown from farm boy to war hero in a single English September. The war continued, of course. The Battle of Britain stretched on for several more weeks, with daily combat over the English Channel and southern England. But something had changed after Mitchell's incident. German pilots began to speak of the Hurricane with reluctant respect. It was no longer the old bird they could ignore or underestimate. It had become a genuine weapon of war, operated by men willing to use it in ways that defied all conventions of aerial combat. The final battle statistics confirmed this shift in perception. Of the 1,542 German aircraft shot down by RAF fighters during the Battle of Britain, 656 were credited to Hurricanes more than all other types of British fighters combined. The Hurricane, the supposedly obsolete aircraft, had become the RAF's most effective bomber-destroyer. Sidney Cam, the aircraft's designer, received the news with quiet satisfaction. He had not created the Hurricane to impress at air shows or break speed records, but for a very specific purpose: to defend Britain. And in that purpose, his creation had exceeded all expectations. The ruggedness the Germans had mocked as outdated turned out to be exactly the quality needed for the brutal fighting over the Channel. Hitler canceled Operation Sea Lion, the plan to invade Britain, in October 1940. Officially, the postponement was due to adverse weather conditions over the English Channel. In reality, the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority over Britain. For the first time since the start of the war, the German military machine had been stopped, forced to retreat by a smaller but determined force. The Hurricane had been instrumental in that victory, not only through its technical capabilities, but through what it represented: Britain's resolve to defend its homeland at any cost. Each Hurricane that took off from the airfield scattered across southern England carried not just weapons and fuel, but the collective refusal of a nation to surrender. That was what the Germans had not calculated, what their intelligence analyses had failed to quantify. How do you measure determination? How do you calculate a people's willingness to sacrifice everything in defense of their freedom? The Hurricane became the symbol of that determination, the physical manifestation of British resistance. It wasn't the most technologically advanced fighter, but it was what the situation required: reliable, durable, deadly when needed, operated by men who understood that some things are worth any sacrifice to protect. Mitchell survived the war, flew missions over occupied France, served in Burma against the Japanese, and was promoted several times. But those 15 minutes over London in September 1940 remained the defining moment of his life. Years later, when veterans gathered in pubs across Britain to share memories and honor the fallen, the story of Hurricane P 3308 was always told, not as a tale of impossible heroism, but as a reminder that wars are won by ordinary men doing extraordinary things when there are no other options. The hurricane had taught a lesson that extended far beyond aerial combat, that sometimes victory does not come from technical or numerical superiority, but from the simple refusal to accept defeat. It was a lesson that would resonate through the decades, a reminder that some battles are won not by the strongest or the fastest, but by the most determined. And in that crucial September of 1940, over the skies of a besieged island, determination had been enough to change the course of world history. The legacy of the hurricane extended far beyond the Battle of Britain. The aircraft remained in production until 1944, with over 14,000 units built. It served in every theater of the war, in the North African desert, the jungles of Burma, the icy Arctic seas, the Russian steppes. But it was over the skies of Britain that it earned its lasting reputation, where it proved that solid engineering and human resolve could overcome seemingly overwhelming advantages. Sidney Cam was knighted in 1953, recognition for a career that included not only the hurricane, but also the Hunter and eventually early contributions to the development of the Harrier. But he always said that his greatest satisfaction was seeing the hurricane fulfill exactly the role it had been designed for, to defend his homeland when it most needed defending. The machine the Germans had mocked as obsolete turned out to be exactly what Churchill meant when he spoke of their finest hour. It was British in its essence, not spectacular, but reliable. Not the fastest, but the most tenacious. Not the most elegant, but the one that got the job done when the job needed doing. If this account touched you in any way, consider subscribing. Here you'll always find respect for the men who lived through what we study today.